today with today's remarkably inspiring lineup of speakers. I'd like to lead with my gratitude and to express my sincere excitement at the incredibly powerful and accomplished work and presentations of my fellow speakers today. So thank you so much to Bea and Alberto of Yaby for organizing these talks. Your thoughtfulness and care is evident across your programming and deeply appreciated. Thank you too to the kind and consummately professional team at ARCO for facilitating today's discussions and making our time together in Madrid possible. In my presentation, I will discuss two works by Lorraine O'Grady. Her first artwork, Cutting Out the New York Times from 1977, and her later revision of it, Cutting Out the New York Times, often known as Cutting Out Konit, from 2017. I'm interested in the way in which these artworks pose questions about race, representation, and the legacy of modernism and its avant-gardes. In my talk, I will give a close reading of these two artworks, contextualizing them within O'Grady's career, as well as within broader debates in Black studies and art history. I will end by locating these artworks within the intellectual lineage of the Black radical tradition, in order to extrapolate some theoretical inquiries, which hopefully we can consider in our conversation today. So Lorraine O'Grady was born in Boston in 1934. After graduating from Wellesley College in 1955, and working for a time as an intelligence analyst for the Department of Labor and State in Washington, D.C., she eventually moved to New York, where she lives and works to this day. The artist currently has a retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum in New York, installation view which is on the screen, titled Both and. And so the talk I'm presenting is adapted from an essay I contributed to the exhibition's catalog. Not long before making Cutting Out the New York Times in 1977, Lorraine O'Grady began psychoanalysis, a process she would later describe as the often unacknowledged linchpin of Western male cultural theory. Shortly after, she was hospitalized for a breast biopsy, taking with her writings by surrealist poet and writer André Breton, she says, to help take my mind off it. Her test results were negative. O'Grady decided to produce a collage for her doctor. She had been flirting with him, and the collage was to be, quote, an imaginary love letter for an imaginary affair. Flipping through a Sunday edition of the New York Times, she came across a headline in the sports section about the basketball player Julius Erving, which read, "The doctor is operating again." Lauded by one commentator as the man who has turned the slam dunk into an art, Erving, affectionately known as Dr. J, or simply the Doctor, was revered for his improvisation and innovation of the free-throw line dunk. The headline was too good to pass up, and the collage became a poem. Between June the 5th and November 20th of that year, O'Grady clipped 25 more poems from successive editions of the Sunday Times. She pasted headlines, subheads, and fragments of ad copy onto white, letter-sized sheets of rag paper, putting these sheets next to each other, edge to edge, to form compositions up to 13 pages long or wide. The first sheet of each sequence contains, to the lower right, a small but familiar New York Times logo alongside the poem's date. Many poems in the series combine magically associative thinking with searching ruminations on love and cultural labor. Quote, "And the promise and perils of learning with the heart. Compare a new mythology to any other. You're the artist. Have we found the beginning of existence or the end of it?" Muses a collage stamped September 25th. Even through layers of facsimile, soft undulations are visible where glue has caused the paper to curl. Many cuttings, mounted at various angles, dance across the paper support. A sharp turn away from earlier traditions of literary composition, the cut-up technique is commonly traced to the Dada activities of the Romanian poet Tristan Tzara. Gathering amid the devastation of World War I, the Dadaists believed that Europe's descent into warfare was linked to modernity's overemphasis on reason at the expense of other facets of human experience. In an effort to negate this system and its aesthetic and social values, they sought an emphatic incomprehensibility. Quote, Dada wished to replace the illogical nonsense of the men of today with an illogical nonsense, explained the French art critic Gabriel Buffet-Becabier, a witness to the movement. Her sentiment finds echoes in Sarah's charming description of, quote, the explosions of elective imbecility, end quote, that occurred at Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, where he, Jean Arp, Hugo Boll, Emmy Hennings, Sophie Talbot Arp, and other dissidents lingered, at war with the war, in 1916. Their incivility was often rooted in their anti-nationalism. Quote, Dada remains within the framework of European weakness, end quote, Zara announced that year, quote, it's all shit, but from now on we want to shit in different colors so as to adorn the zoo of art with all of the flags of all the consulates, end quote. 4 years later, in 1920, speaking at a surrealist rally in Paris, Zara proposed to construct a poem by pulling words out of a hat. A riot ensued, wrecking the theatre, which led to Breton's dismissal of Zara from the nascent surrealist movement. In Dada Manifesto on Feeble Love and Bitter Love, published later the same year, the outcast instructed readers to cut up the words of a newspaper article, shake them gently in a bag, and reorganize the cuttings into new formulations. The cut-up poem attacked the degraded grammar of bourgeois Western rationality by attempting to locate a renewed and nonsensical vocabulary for free expression. Dada ne signifie rien, or Dada means nothing, alleged Zara in 1919, in a broadside that predates René Magritte's famous surrealist dictum, Ceci n'est pas un pipe, this is not a pipe, by a decade. The Dadaist destructions embodied in Zara's instructions exemplified the movement's aspirations to de-skill and theoretically democratize cultural production. Any reader could be, as the poet intoned, quote, an infinitely original author of charming sensibility. But it bears remembering that the media fundamental to Zara's cut-up procedure, newspapers, are culturally constructed and not neutral. Historian Benedict Anderson, in his 1983 study of nations and nationalism, Imagined Communities, argues that newspapers facilitated the emergence of nation-states. By uniting people otherwise separated by geographical distance and social hierarchies in a collective act, reading the news, newspapers gave shape to an experience of citizenship within the homogeneous empty time of capitalist modernity. They provided the space for an ideal national public sphere, not unlike how Art Forum, for example, constructs an imagined community, globally dispersed yet Americentric, of critically engaged readers of contemporary art. But for all the laudable work newspapers do to create such publics, these shared experiences of reading bind the advancement of modernity, and in turn of globalization, to literacy. As global currency, written language severs readers from oral and haptic cultures that, not coincidentally, are often associated with indigenous and non-European ways of life. Cutting entire pages from the New York Times, drawing on them in charcoal and jotting on them in red and blue crayon, artist Adrienne Piper, in her series Vanilla Nightmares, from 1986 to 89, illuminates the underlying racism of news media. Piper's Vanilla Nightmares #1, which is on the screen right now, depicts a black masculine-presenting figure having intercourse with a white feminine-presenting figure. The world is watching, reads the headline, which introduces an article on South African apartheid and debates over economic sanctions. Piper graffitied "What if" on the upper left corner and "So what" toward the lower right. The ambivalence of these words contrasts with the explicit graphic. This tension is complicated by the erasure of sections of each figure's body to reveal photographs of demonstrators in Europe, Australia, and the United States bearing signs such as "Sanctions Now" and "Remember Soweto," a reference to the 1976 uprising and brutal police repression that galvanized global support for the South African freedom struggle. Piper's series recalls the visual juxtapositions of surrealist collages, such as those of Breton, who employed pure psychic automatism to access the trappings of the unconscious mind. In his clinical practice, Sigmund Freud utilized automatic drawing or writing alongside free association to unlock his patients' repressed thoughts. Vanilla Nightmares reveals how close to the surface racism lies. South Africa is testing the patience of the West, a subheading declares, propagating the harmful view that the region can mediate conflict without atoning for its role in the violence of apartheid, among other legacies of colonialism and racial capitalism. Foregrounding sketches of scenes that represent cliches of black violence, the unconscious breaking the surface, Piper indicts the white imaginary and its foundational othering. There's nothing new, Vanilla Nightmares asserts, about the news. Quote, once you realize its limits and begin to see its inexorable investment in certain notions of the subject and subjection, then that language of freedom no longer becomes that which rescues the slave from his or her former condition, but the site of the re-elaboration of that condition rather than its transformation, end quote, Saidiya Hartman has observed. While they might appear to some to provide democratic platforms for representation, institutions like newspapers and museums are complicit in this re-elaboration. They encode representation within particular expectations of literacy. An area of darkness, dream still eludes, O'Grady's collage poem, Just the Two of Us. September 11, 1977. Bellows, proffering an evasive countervision of opacity. Throughout his 2003 book, In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, Fred Moten evokes the cut to suggest that it works to exteriorize modernity's racist unconscious. Entangled in Freud's psychoanalytic writings, Moten's argument reads racism as a libidinal, or that is structural, force. Though he doesn't identify specific cases, his sweeping analysis shows that these drives derive from conditions that continue to inform cultural production to the present day. Building on the late work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed that racism develops not from conscious evil or ignorance, but from unconscious habit and irrational urges, Moten identifies a racist unconscious within modernist avant-gardes. He situates the avant-garde within, quote, an epistemological break and sexual cut that arose in the middle of the 19th century as the codification of aesthetic and political energies that had emerged from the specific condition of possibility of modernity, namely European colonialism, end quote. Racism and misogyny glaringly surface, for example, in the primitivist fantasies of works like Pablo Picasso's oil painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907, which appropriated African tribal masks, and Paul Gauguin's engagements with Tahitian and Javanese cultures in the 1890s. And O'Grady has critically resituated fragments from Picasso's painting in her diptychs, Studies for Flowers of Evil and Good, in 1998, and analyzed the subject in her powerful 1994 essay, Olympia's Maid, Reclaiming Black Female Subjectivity, which points to Edouard Manet's 1863 painting Olympia to criticize exclusionary white Western representations of womanhood in a brilliant art historical critique of white feminism. So I'm lingering here at modernity's racist unconscious, seeking departure points for both progressive and abolitionist dialogues with institutions like the Times or the Brooklyn Museum, where the retrospective was held. But Moten keeps going, like a walking, tangled, spooky bass line, using the full, tremoring resonance of his metaphors of the break and the cut in order to reconcile blackness and the avant-garde. On the subject of lyricism and improvisation within black performance, he writes, quote, such blackness is only in that it exceeds itself. It bears the groundedness of an uncontainable outside. It's an erotics of the cut, submerged in the broken, breaking space-time of an improvisation, end quote. He identifies the oppositionality of blackness and the avant-garde, for, quote, each depends for its coherence upon the exclusion of the other, end quote. Yet in this mutual irreconcilability, within the complex genesis of, quote, an origin that is never fully recoverable, end quote, in this cut, It is the both-and logic of doubleness that characterizes the Black avant-garde. Reading Amiri Baraka's Black Dada Nihilismus from 1964, quote, "A cult of death, need of the simple striking arm, under the street lamp, the cutters from under their rented earth, come up, Black Dada Nihilismus," rages Baraka, discomposing, like vanilla nightmares, the terror of the white subconscious. Moten talks of a black radical tradition that constitutes its radicalism as a cutting and abundant refusal of closure. Moten enwraps ideas in layers of iridescent language. His scholarship is a virtuoso performance in identifying originality without origins. In the break is a protracted and unresolved fling of improvisation and transition. Cutting Out the New York Times manifested O'Grady's unconventional career path from analyst in the Departments of Labor and State, to translator, to rock critic, to professor, and finally to artist. Enigmatically, she has observed that the artwork, produced at a turning point in her life, quote, wasn't about condescending to the culture, it was about taking back from it, end quote. Du Bois analyzed the irrationality of racism. His work suggests that there is, too, a racism to irrationality and a need for anti-racist syntaxes. Negating Dada's cornerstone strategy of negation, Cutting Out the New York Times upturned and reformulated orthodox genealogies of the modernist avant-garde. The poems found what O'Grady calls a sous-réalité, or an under-reality, as she has remarked. While producing Cutting Out the New York Times, O'Grady was employed as an instructor in humanities at the School of Visual Arts, New York, where she taught a course on futurist, Dada, and surrealist literature. And she also taught a second elective class, Poetry and Art, on just two 19th century French poets, Charles Baudelaire and Arthur Rimbaud, whose work she used to examine expressionist and impressionist tendencies in poetry and visual art, and by extension the differences between surrealism and Dada. This familiarity with the history of avant-garde poetics grounded her understanding of her own art-making. Quote, "Unlike the confessional poets of the time who confessed from the inside out," she's reminisced, "I wanted to see if I could create a counter-confessional poetry that would confess from the outside in," end quote. She sought to achieve something different than the Dadaists and Surrealists, who had unlocked the erratic via the aleatory and found the haphazard through chance. Perhaps seeing her world in the throes of globalization as chaotic enough, she worked to produce coherence from the scattered newspaper clippings. When he read the cutouts, my ex-husband said it has been like leafing through the Times and coming across a photo of me accidentally, reflected O'Grady in 2006. I never bought the Sunday Times again. Yet despite its many complexities, the artist considered the work to have failed, stating that its impact has been overwhelmed by its process. And O'Grady has explained that too many rules overwhelmed the compositions, or informed the compositions. In 2017, after a 4-decade break, she set about reformulating the newspaper poems, producing Cutting Out Konit. O'Grady scanned, reprinted, at the larger scale of 41 3/4 by 30 inches, rearranged and refined the earlier compositions. Each poem became a haiku diptych, 25 presented on 2 princely sheets of Japanese paper. 26, and 1 composed on a single sheet. 26 haiku propositions were made in all, the source of each a single 1977 poem. Utilizing the diptych format for this new body of work, O'Grady returned to the form that defines her artistic career, the both and irresoluteness that unsettles the either-or binarism of the Western philosophical tradition. And time is another recurring concern for the artist. In the amber glow of the August skin, there is no escape from terror. The sun also rises on new tracks without a railroad, reads one poem. Here, the language is surreal but tender. The difficult abstracted image of tracks with no railroad is softened by the rays of a rising sun. Progress is questioned and epiphany is located in the cyclical temporality of the day. the reiterative nature of which gives shape and form to oppositional pairings. Moments of self-reflexivity suggest the confidence of an artist in command of her narrative and her process. One of us excites you, one of us delights you, reads one panel. Is it déjà vu? O'Grady has suggested that the later work corrected her prior failure. She had finally located a counter-confessional voice. Still, it seems important to me to refuse to see the relationship between the two works as resolved. Revisiting an early work, the artist pauses within the space of the déjà vu, or the already seen, in a gesture that ruptures the historiography of modernity. Together, the two artworks align with Moten's definition of improvisation, which he describes as, quote, finally, precisely, that motion that is free of the systematic oscillation that begins and ends at the illusion of the originary, the primordial, the systematic oscillation that therefore never ends, end quote. Their movement between two positions follows the logic not of negation, but of multiplicity. This is the work installed at the Brooklyn Museum in the retrospective, alongside archival presentations and another series of photographs. In Art History and the Dialogics of Diaspora from 2012, Cobbin and Mercer formulates an art historical methodology that can speak to the cultural production of the Black diaspora. His essay addresses the phenomenological and political experience of doubling, while working to fracture binarist thought systems. He examines Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, the, quote, sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, end quote, as well as the Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin's principle of dialogism, or double voicing, which describes a voice that constantly engages with and is informed by other locations and voices. Quote, conceptualizing knowledge production as a border-crossing practice, Bakhtin evoked a round trip whereby the outbound journey of putting oneself in the place of another is followed by a return journey in which one's own self-positioning can be reevaluated anew, Mercer writes. O'Grady's feminism, which scrutinizes her Black female positionality, has consistently affirmed this, as her words on the subject of subjectivity in Olympia's Maid convey, quote, if what I suspect is true, that it contains a multiplicity of centers and all the boundaries are fluid, then most of what will interest me is occurring in the between spaces, end quote. Dialogic thinking makes meaning in the round-trip movements between incommensurable positions. While Mercer's work accounts for asymmetrical global problem spaces, Cutting Out the New York Times and Cutting Out Konit address a local diaspora, the Self. In a back-and-forth dialogue across 4 decades, the artworks constitute an ambivalent and decisive diptych in their own right, one that resonates with the cutting and abundant refusal of closure. Moten writes, this refusal of closure is not a rejection, but an ongoing and reconstructive improvisation of ensemble, end quote. And Robin Kelly, in his foreword to the 2nd edition, published in the year 2000 of Cedric Robertson's Black Marxism, writes, quote, perhaps more than any other book, Black Marxism shifts the center of radical thought and revolution from Europe to the so-called periphery, to the colonial territories, marginalized people of color in the metropolitan centers of capital, and those Frantz Fanon identified as the wretched of the earth. And it makes a persuasive case that the radical thought and practice which emerged in these sites of colonial and racial capitalist exploitation were produced by cultural logics and epistemologies of the oppressed, as well as the specific racial and cultural forms of domination. Thus, Robinson not only decenters Marxist history and historiography, but also what one might call the eye of the storm, end quote. And I'm wrapping up now, but by way of conclusion or posing of another question, I would like to note that Robinson's method in Black Marxism offers a way of thinking about the aesthetics, thinking through the aesthetics of modernism and its avant-gardes. And this is the method that Moten, a student of Robinson's, builds from in the Break. It is likewise, I believe, a method that O'Grady interrogates and departs from. By recursively working through the legacies of Baudelaire, the Dadaists, the Surrealists, O'Grady contests and critiques the material and ideological conditions that fostered the emergence of these modernist avant-gardes, and articulates a break from these conditions of gendered racial capitalism by way of a black feminist radicalism. At this moment of extreme crisis in world capitalism, it is globally manifest that the storm is deepening and widening and cutting into our daily lives in dislocating ways. In the Wake, Christina Sharp argues that this storm, this weather, is anti-blackness and white supremacy as a total climate that produces premature black death as normative. In thinking with Sharp, we might describe today's storm as a déjà vu, a storm that's been raging since 1452, if not earlier. And perhaps, therefore, the déjà vu emerges as a method for considering continuity and difference. And so I add in the wake to in the break in this presentation's theoretical armature in order to attempt to pose a question. An experiment that challenges the formal boundaries of art and poetry. Cutting Out the New York Times was one of the first works in O'Grady's oeuvre, a remarkable body of work that she has characterized as a practice of, quote, writing in space, end quote. So what then might it mean to think through O'Grady's method ecologically? Robinson was considering centers and margins, and it occurs to me that collage transforms the relationship between text and margins. What insights and what methods do O'Grady's unresolvable diptychs offer to those of us thinking critically through the spatial practices and geographies of global contemporary art? So I'm looking forward very much to hearing the rest of the presentations today and to continuing the dialogues, and I'm more than happy to receive any questions if I haven't gone over time. But thank you so much for listening.